It's great to be back with you this morning after a few weeks off, and great to be able to share a little from God's Word with you. When we come this morning to Psalm 127, we're coming to the 8th part in this series of studies in what are called the Songs of Ascent. These 15 Psalms from number 120 through to 134. They're the Psalms that were used by God's people Israel to sing as they climbed 3 times a year up to the religious feasts in Jerusalem. They're songs for pilgrims, songs for people who are going to God. And that's why we're so interested in them, because disciples of Jesus Christ are pilgrims. We're following him on the way. In fact, we've taken him at his word whenever he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me." As we've looked at these Psalms over the last few weeks, it's quite possible that some of them, or some parts of them, have felt familiar to you. Some of this material is well known. And that may be particularly the case with this morning's Psalm. In Psalm 127, verse 1, we read, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain." I can think of a couple of contexts where that well-known passage is regularly used. So, for example, in a wedding, the minister uses this verse to remind a newly married couple that God ought to be at the center of the new home that they're going to build together. Or this verse is sometimes used when a church is embarking on a building project or dedicating new buildings. The minister uses the verse to remind the congregation with a new building that it's going to be useless unless God himself chooses to bless the work that takes place in it. So with people using this psalm in these kinds of ways, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that Psalm 127 is about building homes or building churches. Even the title associates this psalm with Solomon, who was famous for building the temple in Jerusalem. But there's more going on here than building, much, much more. This isn't so much an anthem for the building site as it's a song for all who work. If we read on in verses 1 to 2, that becomes clear. "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. In vain you rise up early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat." It's a song about building work, yes, but it's also a song about the work of protecting our property and of all the toil that gets us out of bed in the morning and keeps us working till late at night. Work is the universal human occupation. It's one of the main contexts for our pilgrimage, our journey to God. Work is the theme of Psalm 127. It's important that we think clearly about our work because it's such a major component of life. It's unavoidable. Most of us, other than the landed gentry in our congregation, have had to work for a living. Sometimes our work's good, and sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's a place where sin takes grip of our lives, and sometimes it's a place where our faith matures. If we're to grow as disciples of Jesus Christ, then we can't ignore our work. We need to learn to do the will of God in our work. Our workplace needs to become a place where we're being transformed into the likeness of Jesus. As we look at Psalm 127 this morning, we're going to see 2 things. 1, a wrong way of working, and 2, a right way of working. So first of all, the opening couple of verses tell us in plain terms about a wrong way of working independent of God. building houses, providing protection, and all our other work will be in vain, says Solomon, a waste of time unless God is in it. Right at the beginning of our Bibles, we're told a story of work done independent of God. The Tower of Babel, the greatest work project in the ancient world, it was an unparalleled disaster. We're told in the opening paragraph of Genesis 11 that the people said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth." These guys want to build a city for themselves so that they can make a name for themselves. Their effort, albeit very impressive, albeit on a huge scale, is in vain. They're working independent of God. Friends, the reality is that much work, probably most of the work that goes on in our world today, is done in the spirit of Babel. Countless people put in vast amounts of effort with little or nothing else in mind than building a little empire for themselves, making a name for themselves. Their work's done independently of God. And in the end, their work's going to be every bit as futile as the work at Babel. The main difference between Christians and other people is that we take God seriously. We really believe that God is the center of all reality and existence. We really do pay attention to what he does and he says. We really do try to do our work with God in mind. You'll notice that I've started to talk about God and the work that he's doing. You see, God is a worker. It's the premise of this psalm that God works. Unless the Lord builds the house, unless the Lord watches over the city. You see, God builds and he watches. God does work. The Bible's not slow to tell us that God's a worker. In the opening verse of the whole Bible, there's an announcement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, in the beginning, God sat majestic in heaven. It doesn't say, in the beginning, God was filled with beauty and love. No, in the beginning, God created. He did something. He made something. Genesis chapter 1, you could read it as God's timesheet. It tells us about the work that God has done. And the most important work going on in our world today is the work that God is doing. After Genesis 1 introduces our God who works, the rest of the Bible gives us great detail about the kind of work that God does in this world. He's created this world and he keeps creating new wonders every day. He provides help and comfort, compassion and salvation. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul gives us a glorious one-sentence summary of the work that God is doing. God is at work to bring all things in heaven and on earth under one head, even Christ. So, God the Father is working in our world today to bring people together as a community gathered around his Son, Jesus. We're talking just now about wrong ways of working. Our work goes wrong when we do it independently of God. And when we do that, we become anxious, we worry about the outcomes, we become frantic, we start to imagine that everything depends on us. In vain, we rise early and stay up late. Psalm 127 warns us about working independently of the God who works. I don't know if you noticed it, but in this psalm, Solomon sees only two possible outcomes for our work. It'll either be God's work, or it'll be a waste of time. There is no third option. In a moment, we're going to come back to the second part of our psalm to think about the right way of working, how we can ensure that our work isn't a waste of time. Before we do that, we're going to listen to a song. It's by Andy Flanagan. Some of you might know Andy. He was around Queen's when I was a student back in the early 90s. It's a song about work and about the truth that God is with us in our work, wherever we are, whatever we do.